To the Sioux, guardians of the Great Plains. Welcome tonight. We're going to talk about the Sioux people, one of the most iconic and significant indigenous nations of North America. Their story spans centuries of sovereignty on the Great Plains, a golden age of mounted warrior culture, devastating conflict with an expanding nation, and a remarkable persistence that continues to shape the American landscape today. This is a narrative of a people whose name became synonymous with resistance, whose leaders became legends, and who struggle to maintain their way of life against overwhelming odds. Remains one of the most compelling chapters in the history of the American West. As we journey through this story, we will explore not just battles and treaties, but the rich culture, spiritual depth, and enduring resilience of a nation that refused to disappear. The people we know today as the Sioux never called themselves by that name. The word Sioux is actually derived from a French corruption of an Ojibwe word meaning little snakes or enemies. It was a name given to them by rivals, adopted by European colonizers, and eventually accepted by history. The Sioux people called themselves the Ochéti-Shakowing, which translates to Seven Council Fires, a name that speaks to their political structure and spiritual understanding of their nation. Within this confederation were three major divisions, each with its own dialect, customs and territory, yet all bound together by shared ancestry, similar languages, and mutual defense. These divisions were the Dakota in the east, the Nakota in the middle, and the Lakota in the west. Together, they formed one of the most formidable indigenous powers on the North American continent. Before we can understand the conflicts that would define the Sioux in the American imagination, we must first understand who they were before European contact fundamentally altered their world. The ancestors of the Sioux lived in the woodlands of what is now Minnesota and the western Great Lakes region. They were a people of lakes and forests, skilled in canoe travel, hunting woodland game, and harvesting wild rice from the shallow waters. Their homes were bark lodges, their economy based on hunting, gathering, and limited agriculture. They lived in a world of abundant game, clear waters, and dense forests, a world that would eventually push them westward into an entirely different landscape. The exact timeline of Sioux migration onto the Great Plains is debated by historians and archaeologists, but most evidence suggests a gradual movement beginning in the late 1600s and accelerating through the 1700s. This migration was not a simple choice, but a complex response to multiple pressures. The arrival of Europeans on the eastern seaboard had created a ripple effect that reached deep into the continent's interior. European trade goods, particularly firearms, were spreading westward through indigenous trade networks, creating new power dynamics among tribes. Groups armed with guns, such as the Ojibwe and Cree, began pushing westward, encroaching on Sioux territory. At the same time, the fur trade was depleting game in the eastern woodlands, making traditional hunting grounds less productive. Faced with armed pressure from the east and diminishing resources, Sioux bands began moving westward, gradually adapting to a new environment that would transform their entire culture. The Great Plains that the Sioux encountered was a landscape of overwhelming vastness. It was a sea of grass that stretched from horizon to horizon, interrupted only by scattered river valleys and the occasional outcropping of badlands or hills. Summers were blazingly hot, winters brutally cold, and the wind never seemed to stop. Water was scarce away from the rivers, and wood for building and fuel was rare on the open prairie. For a people accustomed to the sheltered forests of Minnesota, this must have seemed an alien and challenging environment. Yet it was also a landscape of incredible abundance, at least for those who could adapt to its rhythms. The Great Plains were home to the largest concentration of large mammals in North America, dominated by a single species that would transform Sioux culture, the American buffalo. The buffalo, or more accurately, the American bison, existed in numbers that modern minds struggle to comprehend. Estimates suggest that between 30 and 60 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains before European contact decimated their numbers. They moved in herds that could stretch for miles, blackening the prairie like a living tide. For the Sioux and other Plains tribes, the buffalo was not merely a food source but the foundation of an entire way of life. From the buffalo came meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools and weapons, sinew for thread and bowstrings, horns for containers and ceremonial objects, and even dried dung for fuel in a landscape where wood was scarce. A successful buffalo hunt could provide everything a community needed to survive and thrive on the harsh prairie. However, hunting buffalo on foot was extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Buffalo were huge, powerful animals that could easily kill a human with their horns or hooves. Hunting them required either driving them over cliffs in carefully orchestrated buffalo jumps, surrounding them with large groups of hunters, or approaching them with incredible stealth. These methods required extensive coordination, considerable risk, and limited the number of animals that could be taken. The early Sioux on the plains lived in a state of semi-nomadism, following the herds on foot, carrying their possessions on their backs or on dog-pulled travois. It was a hard life, and the Sioux remained relatively minor players on the plains, overshadowed by groups who had adapted to the environment earlier. Everything changed when the Sioux acquired horses. The horse had been extinct in the Sioux Americas for thousands of years, disappearing at the end of the last ice age. The Spanish reintroduced them to North America in the 1500s, and from Spanish settlements in Mexico and New Mexico, horses gradually spread northward through trade and theft. By the early 1700s, as horses were reaching the northern plains, for the Sioux, the arrival of the horse was nothing short of revolutionary. A mounted hunter could ride alongside a running buffalo, selecting specific animals and making clean kills. A mounted warrior could travel vast distances, raid enemy camps, and escape pursuit. Families could transport far more possessions, allowing for larger, more comfortable teepees and accumulated wealth. The horse transformed the Sioux from struggling newcomers on the plains into dominant powers. With horses, the Sioux population expanded rapidly. Their territory grew as they pushed out or dominated rival groups. The Lakota division of the Sioux became particularly successful, expanding across the northern plains and into the region that would become the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana. They pushed the Crow westward, fought the Pawnee to the south, and competed with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, eventually forming alliances with the latter two groups. The Sioux developed a culture centered around mounted warfare, buffalo hunting, and a profound spiritual connection to the land they had claimed. This was the golden age of Sioux culture, roughly spanning from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s, a period when the Sioux were masters of the northern plains. To understand the Sioux at their height, we must understand their social and political structure. The Seven Council Fires was not a unified state in the European sense, but a confederation of related groups with considerable autonomy. Each of the three main divisions, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, was further divided into bands, and each band into smaller family groups called Tioshpai. The Tioshpai was the basic unit of Sioux society, an extended family group that traveled, hunted, and lived together. Several Tioshpai formed a band led by a chief chosen for his wisdom, generosity, and leadership ability, rather than by hereditary succession. Bands came together for important ceremonies, large buffalo hunts, and councils, but for much of the year operated independently. Leadership among the Sioux was earned, not inherited, and it was maintained through continuous demonstration of worthy qualities. A chief was expected to be generous, often giving away most of his possessions to those in need. He was expected to be wise in counsel, brave in war, and concerned for the welfare of his people above his own interests. If a chief became selfish, cowardly, or foolish, people would simply stop following him. This created a system where leaders had to continuously prove themselves worthy of their position. Alongside civilian chiefs were war chiefs, men who had proven themselves in battle and led war parties. A single band might have multiple chiefs with different areas of responsibility, and decisions affecting the entire band were typically made in council, where any warrior had the right to speak. The Sioux warrior culture has often been romanticized or misunderstood, but it was a complex system with its own rules and values. Warfare among Plains tribes before large-scale conflict with the United States was typically not about territorial conquest or annihilation of enemies. Instead, it was about proving individual courage, acquiring horses and other wealth, avenging deaths, and gaining prestige. A warrior gained honor through acts of bravery called counting coup, which included touching an enemy in battle without killing him, stealing horses from an enemy camp, rescuing a wounded comrade, or being the first to strike an enemy. Killing an enemy was honored, but it was often considered less brave than counting coup, which required getting close enough to touch a foe who could fight back. This system meant that while warfare was frequent, it was often relatively limited in its bloodshed compared to European wars. Raids might result in a few deaths on each side, the theft of horses, and the taking of some captives. This is not to say that Plains warfare was not real or deadly. People certainly died, and some conflicts could be quite brutal. But the total wars of annihilation were rare until the conflicts with the United States changed the nature of warfare on the Plains. For young Sioux men, proving oneself in war was essential to gaining status, attracting wives, and being respected in the community. The warrior societies, organizations of men who had proven themselves in battle, were central to Sioux social life, conducting ceremonies, maintaining order in camp, and coordinating hunts and raids. Sioux spiritual life was rich and complex, centered on the belief that everything in the natural world possessed spiritual power, or wakan. The universe was filled with spirits, from the great Wakan Tanka, the great mystery or great spirit, to the spirits of animals, plants, places, and natural forces. Maintaining good relations with these spirits was essential for success in hunting, warfare, healing, and all other aspects of life. This was accomplished through prayer, ceremonies, and offerings. Individual Sioux sought personal visions through fasting and isolation, hoping to receive guidance from the spirit world. These vision quests were particularly important for young men seeking to discover their path in life and gain spiritual power. The most important Sioux ceremony was the Sun Dance, an annual gathering that brought together multiple bands for renewal, thanksgiving, and spiritual connection. The Sun Dance was a complex, multi-day ceremony involving fasting, dancing, prayer, and personal sacrifice. Some participants would pierce their chest or back muscles and attach themselves to a central pole with leather thongs, dancing until the flesh tore free. This was not torture, but a sacred offering of the dancer's own body in prayer for the welfare of the people. The Sun Dance reinforced tribal bonds, renewed spiritual power, and marked the great summer gathering when the scattered bands came together. It was so central to Sioux identity that when the United States government later banned it, the prohibition struck at the very heart of Sioux culture. Women in Sioux society held important and respected roles, though these were different from men's roles. While men hunted and went to war, women owned the teepee and everything in it. They processed buffalo hides into leather, made clothing, gathered wild plants for food and medicine, raised children, and maintained the camp. A skilled woman who could tan hides beautifully, sew intricate quill work or beadwork, and manage a household efficiently was highly valued. Women could own property, could divorce their husbands if treated poorly, and their opinions were often sought in important decisions. Some women became warriors or medicine people, though this was less common. The division of labor was not about superiority, but about complementary roles that made the community function. The Sioux diet, while centered on buffalo, was more varied than popular imagination suggests. In addition to buffalo, they hunted elk, deer, antelope, and smaller game. They gathered wild turnips, berries, and other plant foods. They fished when near rivers and lakes. The Lakota, in particular, traded extensively with more agricultural tribes like the Arikara, exchanging buffalo products for corn, beans, and squash. Food was preserved through drying, allowing the Sioux to build up stores for winter when hunting was more difficult. Pemmican, a mixture of dried buffalo meat, fat, and berries, was a nutritious, long-lasting food, perfect for travel or winter storage. The teepee was the perfect dwelling for the nomadic life of Plains Sioux. Made from buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles, it could be set up or taken down in less than an hour by a few skilled women. The cone shape shed rain and snow, resisted the constant prairie wind, and could be heated efficiently with a small fire. Smoke flaps at the top could be adjusted to draw smoke out while keeping rain from coming in. In winter, an inner lining created an insulating air space, while in summer, the bottom could be raised to allow cooling breezes. The teepee was not a crude shelter, but a sophisticated piece of engineering, perfectly adapted to its environment. Some teepees were decorated with painted scenes depicting the owner's visions, achievements, or spiritual symbols, making each lodge a unique work of art. This was the world of the Sioux at their height, a world of vast grasslands and endless sky, of buffalo herds and mounted hunts, of warrior courage and spiritual depth, of closely knit communities living in harmony with a harsh but bountiful environment. It was a way of life that seemed eternal, ordained by the spirits, as permanent as the prairie itself. The Sioux could not have known that even as they reached the zenith of their power in the early 1800s, forces were already in motion that would shatter their world within a few generations. The first sustained contact between the Sioux and Euro-Americans came through the fur trade. French traders had long operated in the Great Lakes region, and some had dealings with the eastern Dakota bands. But the real opening of the plains to American expansion came with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, when the United States acquired from France an enormous territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. President Thomas Jefferson immediately organized the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore this new acquisition and establish American presence in the region. When Lewis and Clark traveled up the Missouri River in 1804 and 1805, they encountered various Sioux bands. These early encounters were tense but generally peaceful, though they established a pattern that would repeat itself. American officials insisting on their authority over lands the Sioux considered their own, and Sioux leaders politely but firmly rejecting American claims to dominance. The expedition members were impressed by the Sioux, noting their numbers, their horsemanship, and their martial bearing. These were clearly a powerful people who would not be easily pushed aside. For several decades, contact between the Sioux and Euro-Americans remained limited. The fur trade brought goods and disease, but not large numbers of settlers. The Great Plains, which Americans called the Great American Desert, was considered unsuitable for American settlement. The agricultural techniques of the time could not cope with the dry climate, and the vastness of the prairie seemed alien to people accustomed to wooded, well-watered lands. The government's policy was to move eastern tribes west of the Mississippi, treating the Great Plains as a permanent Indian territory where tribes could live undisturbed by white settlement. This proved to be a short-lived policy. The 1840s brought the first major wave of white travelers across Sioux territory. The Oregon Trail, California Trail, and Mormon Trail all crossed lands claimed by the Sioux, particularly the Lakota. Thousands of emigrants in covered wagons streamed westward, seeking land in Oregon or gold in California. They traveled in spring and summer, the same season when the Sioux needed the grass along the Platte River to be fresh for their horses and the buffalo. The wagon trains consumed the grass, frightened away game, and brought diseases like cholera. The emigrants were passing through, not settling, but their impact was profound. The United States government, recognizing that this traffic was disrupting indigenous peoples and wanting to establish clear terms for travel across Indian lands, called for a Great Treaty Council. In 1851, thousands of Plains Indians gathered at Fort Laramie in what is now Wyoming for what became known as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. It was one of the largest gatherings of Plains tribes ever assembled. The government wanted tribes to agree to peaceful relations, to allow safe passage for emigrants, and to accept defined territorial boundaries for each tribe. In return, the government promised annual payments of goods and protection from settler encroachment within tribal territories. For the Sioux, particularly the Lakota, the treaty recognized their claim to a vast territory including much of present-day South Dakota, northern Nebraska, and parts of Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota. This included the sacred Black Hills, Paha Sapa in Lakota, a region of forested peaks and valleys that rose from the prairie like an island. The Black Hills were central to Lakota spirituality, a place of vision quests, ceremonies, and profound connection to the sacred. The treaty promised that this land would belong to the Sioux for as long as the rivers flowed and the grass grew. It was a promise that would be broken within a generation. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 brought a brief period of relative peace, but the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. The United States saw the treaty as a step toward eventual control of the plains, while the Sioux saw it as recognition of their sovereignty over their homeland. These incompatible understandings would inevitably lead to conflict. That conflict was hastened by a seemingly minor incident in 1854 that spiraled into violence and set a pattern for decades to come. In August 1854, a Mormon emigrant traveling on the Oregon Trail reported that a Lakota had killed one of his cows. The cow was apparently lame and had wandered into a Lakota camp. A young warrior, possibly hungry after a poor hunting season, had killed it. The emigrant demanded compensation. The Lakota chief, Conquering Bear, who had signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, offered to compensate the emigrant with horses, but the emigrant refused and insisted the warrior be arrested. A young, arrogant army lieutenant named John Grattan decided to go to the Lakota camp to arrest the warrior and assert American authority. Grattan took about 30 soldiers, including an interpreter who was drunk and belligerent, to a camp containing hundreds of Lakota warriors. The chief tried to negotiate, but the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Exactly who fired first is disputed, but gunfire erupted. The Lakota warriors killed Grattan and all his men. Conquering Bear was mortally wounded in the exchange, dying of his wounds a few days later. This incident, known as the Grattan Massacre to Americans and the Grattan Fight to the Lakota, destroyed the fragile peace established by the Fort Laramie Treaty. The United States Army's response the following year showed the Sioux what American vengeance looked like. General William Harney led a punitive expedition that attacked a Lakota camp at Blue Water Creek in Sioux, Nebraska. The camp was predominantly women, children, and elderly people, as most of the warriors were away hunting. Harney's troops killed over 80 Lakota and took dozens of women and children prisoner. This was total war against entire communities rather than just warriors. The message was clear. Resistance to American authority would be met with overwhelming force, directed not just at warriors, but at entire populations. Despite this brutal beginning, a period of uneasy coexistence continued through much of the 1850s and early 1860s. The Sioux still controlled most of their territory, buffalo were still abundant, and the old way of life continued. But changes were accelerating. In 1858, gold was discovered in what is now Colorado, bringing a rush of miners across Sioux territory. More trails opened, more forts were built, and more settlers began eyeing the fertile river valleys. Then came the event that would transform the American West and doom the Sioux way of life: the Civil War. While the Civil War raged in the eastern states from 1861 to 1865, its effects rippled westward. Troops were withdrawn from western forts to fight in the east, emboldening some tribes to resist American encroachment. In Minnesota, the Dakota Sioux, subjected to years of broken treaty promises, late annuity payments, and settler encroachment, rose in violent rebellion in 1862. The Dakota War, as it became known, resulted in hundreds of deaths on both sides before the Dakota were defeated. The aftermath was brutal. 38 Dakota men were hanged in the largest mass execution in American history, and the Dakota were expelled from Minnesota. This eastern conflict had profound effects on the Lakota to the west, proving that American vengeance could be total and unforgiving. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States turned its full attention to the West. The Transcontinental Railroad was under construction, and the government was determined to open the Great Plains to settlement. This required dealing with the Plains tribes, particularly the powerful Sioux and their allies. The government's approach combined negotiation with military pressure, alternately offering peace and threatening war, trying to convince tribes to accept life on reservations, where they would be fed and taught to farm like white settlers. Many Sioux leaders recognized that their world was changing and that some accommodation with American power might be necessary. But the Lakota were not a unified state with a single government that could negotiate for all. Each band was autonomous, and what one chief agreed to did not necessarily bind others. This created endless complications as government officials negotiated treaties with some leaders, while other leaders rejected those same agreements and continued fighting. From the American perspective, this seemed like duplicity and bad faith. From the Sioux perspective, it was simply the reality of their political structure. One leader who emerged during this period would become legendary for his resistance: Red Cloud. Born around 1822, Red Cloud was a warrior of the Oglala Lakota who gained fame through his military prowess. By the 1860s, he was one of the most respected war leaders among the Lakota. When the United States attempted to build forts along the Bozeman Trail, which cut through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds in the Powder River country of Wyoming and Montana, Red Cloud determined to drive them out. Red Cloud's War, as it became known, lasted from 1866 to 1868 and was one of the most successful indigenous resistance campaigns against the United States. Red Cloud and his allies, including Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors, laid siege to the American forts. They attacked supply trains, cut off communications, and made the posts untenable. The most famous engagement was the Fetterman Fight in December 1866, when Lakota and Cheyenne warriors lured Captain William Fetterman and 80 soldiers into an ambush and killed them all. It was one of the worst defeats the U.S. Army had suffered in Indian warfare up to that point. Red Cloud's resistance forced the United States to negotiate. In 1868, a new Fort Laramie Treaty was signed. The government agreed to abandon the forts along the Bozeman Trail and recognize Lakota control of a Great Sioux reservation encompassing all of present-day South Dakota west of the Missouri River, including the sacred Black Hills. The treaty also recognized the Powder River Country in Wyoming and Montana as unceded Indian territory, where the Sioux and their allies could hunt as long as buffalo remained sufficient. Red Cloud had won, or so it seemed. He had forced the United States to accept Sioux terms and recognize Sioux sovereignty over their heartland. Red Cloud signed the treaty and moved to an agency where he would receive government rations and work for peace. His decision to accept the treaty was pragmatic. He recognized American power, understood that the buffalo were declining, and hoped that by cooperating, he could secure a future for his people, even as their traditional way of life became impossible. Other Lakota leaders made different choices. Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man and war leader, refused to sign the treaty and continued living in the traditional way, hunting buffalo and rejecting American authority. Crazy Horse, an Oglala warrior known for his mystical visions and extraordinary bravery, similarly rejected the reservation and continued the old life. The Lakota split between those who accepted the new reality and those who resisted it, a division that would have profound consequences. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 might have brought lasting peace if it had been honored, but it was not. In 1874, the Army sent an expedition into the Black Hills, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Ostensibly a scientific and mapping expedition, it included miners who discovered gold. Custer's report of gold in the Black Hills set off a rush that the government made no real effort to stop. Thousands of miners flooded into the Black Hills, blatantly violating the treaty. The government, seeing opportunity in the gold and under pressure from mining interests, decided to take the Black Hills rather than defend Sioux treaty rights. The government's approach was to offer to buy the Black Hills. In 1875, commissioners met with Sioux leaders and offered $6 million for the Black Hills and the unceded hunting territories. The Sioux, for whom the Black Hills were sacred, refused. Sitting Bull, speaking for the non-treaty Lakota, said he wouldn't sell even a pinch of dust from the Black Hills. The government, unwilling to enforce its own treaty or evict the miners, decided on a different strategy. It issued an ultimatum. All Sioux must report to agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile and subject to military action. This ultimatum was unreasonable in multiple ways. It was issued in winter, when traveling across the snow-covered plains was extremely difficult. The deadline was impossibly short for bands scattered across a vast territory. Many bands never received the order at all, and it fundamentally violated the Fort Laramie Treaty, which guaranteed the Sioux the right to hunt in the unceded territories. The ultimatum was designed to create a pretext for war, a war that would force all Sioux onto reservations and open the Black Hills to unrestricted mining. When the deadline passed and many Sioux had not reported to agencies, either because they refused or because they couldn't, the Army launched a winter campaign to force them in. 3 columns of troops converged on the Powder River country where the non-treaty Sioux were wintering. The campaign began badly for the Army when a force under Colonel Joseph Reynolds attacked a Cheyenne village, only to be driven off after destroying the village but suffering embarrassing losses. As spring came, more Sioux left the agencies to join the free bands for the summer buffalo hunt. Traditional Lakota who had spent winter on agencies receiving rations would often leave in spring to hunt and practice their old ways, returning in fall. This pattern meant that the numbers of warriors with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse swelled enormously in late spring and early summer of 1876. Sitting Bull called for a great gathering of all the Lakota and their allies. Thousands came, forming a village of perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 people, including 2,000 to 3,000 warriors. It was one of the largest gatherings of Plains Indians ever assembled. Sitting Bull conducted a sundance ceremony, during which he had a vision of soldiers falling into camp upside down, which he interpreted as a great victory coming. The village moved through the Powder River country and into Montana, following the buffalo and celebrating their freedom and power. The Army's 3 columns were still searching for this village, unaware of its size. On June 17, 1876, one column under General George Crook encountered the village's warriors at the Battle of the Rosebud. In a hard-fought engagement, Crook was forced to withdraw, effectively removing his column from the campaign. The other 2 columns continued searching. One of these was commanded by General Alfred Terry and included the 7th Cavalry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, the same Custer who had led the expedition into the Black Hills 2 years before. Custer was an ambitious, aggressive officer with a reputation for bold, sometimes reckless action. He had won fame in the Civil War and saw action against Plains tribes in the late 1860s. He was certain he could defeat any Indian force he encountered and was eager for glory. When his Crow and Arikara scouts found the massive Lakota Cheyenne village along the Little Bighorn River on June 25, 1876, Custer decided to attack immediately, despite having no clear idea of the village's size, and despite his orders to wait for reinforcements from Terry's column. What happened next became one of the most famous battles in American history. Custer divided his regiment into 3 battalions. He sent Captain Frederick Benteen on a scouting mission, assigned Major Marcus Reno to attack the southern end of the village, and led his own battalion in what appears to have been an attempt to strike the village from the north. Reno's attack ran into fierce resistance. Warriors poured out of the village led by Crazy Horse, Gall, and others. Reno's men were driven back across the river and took up defensive positions on a bluff, where they were besieged. Custer's battalion advanced toward the northern end of the village, but was spotted before they could attack. The warriors who had defeated Reno turned their attention to Custer's force. Exactly what happened remains debated because no one in Custer's command survived, but archaeological evidence and native accounts paint a picture of a running fight that moved across the ridges east of the river. Custer's men were surrounded, overwhelmed, and killed to the last man. Custer himself died on what became known as Custer Hill, along with about 210 officers and men of the 7th Cavalry. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, known to the Lakota as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, was the greatest Native American victory against the United States Army. It was exactly the kind of victory Sitting Bull had envisioned. The warriors had defended their people, their way of life, and their freedom. They had defeated the army so decisively that the soldiers ceased to exist as a fighting force. The village celebrated, then moved on, knowing that more soldiers would come. The Lakota and Cheyenne were right to expect retaliation. News of Custer's defeat, arriving just before the United States centennial celebration on July 4th, 1876, shocked and enraged the American public. The army poured resources into the campaign. More troops were sent, and the non-treaty Sioux and Cheyenne were hunted relentlessly. The great village that had won at Little Bighorn broke up into smaller bands, trying to evade the army and find buffalo, but there was no respite. The army changed its tactics. Instead of trying to defeat the Sioux in pitched battles, They pursued a war of attrition. Troops marched in winter when travel was hardest for the mobile Sioux villages. They attacked camps, destroying food stores, teepees, and supplies, leaving people to face the winter with nothing. They struck at horses, killing or capturing the herds that made the Sioux mobile. And they found a weapon more devastating than any rifle. They attacked the buffalo. The buffalo were already in decline, overhunted for their hides by white hunters who took only the skin and left the meat to rot. The army recognized that destroying the buffalo would destroy the Sioux way of life and encouraged the slaughter. Professional hunters armed with powerful long-range rifles systematically exterminated the herds. Where millions had roamed a generation before, by the late 1870s, the buffalo were becoming rare. Without buffalo, the Sioux could not feed or clothe themselves in the traditional way. They faced a choice: starvation on the plains or surrender, and life on the reservation. One by one, the bands gave up. Crazy Horse, after a winter of hardship and hunger, brought his people in to surrender in May 1877. He had fought longer than almost anyone, but he could not fight the disappearance of the buffalo or the endless columns of soldiers. Even in surrender, Crazy Horse remained dangerous to American authorities. He was a symbol of resistance, and rumors, possibly unfounded, spread that he planned to leave the reservation and fight again. In September 1877, soldiers attempted to imprison him. In the struggle, Crazy Horse was bayoneted, dying that night at about 36 years old. His death remains controversial, with questions about whether it was an accident or murder never fully resolved. Sitting Bull held out longer. He led his people into Canada, beyond the reach of American soldiers. The Canadian government allowed them to stay but provided no support, and there were no buffalo in their refuge. For 4 years, Sitting Bull's people endured poverty and hunger, gradually dwindling in numbers as individuals and families drifted back across the border to surrender. Finally, in July 1881, Sitting Bull himself crossed back into the United States and surrendered. The last of the great Lakota resistance leaders had been defeated not by soldiers, but by starvation. The conquest of the Sioux was complete. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which had promised the Great Sioux Reservation forever, was unilaterally broken. The government seized the Black Hills and the unceded hunting territories. The Sioux were confined to reservations dependent on government rations that were often inadequate and late in arriving. There, horses were taken, their weapons confiscated, and their children sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak Lakota or practice their culture. The Sundance was banned as savage and uncivilized. Everything that had defined Sioux life was stripped away or forbidden. The reservation period was perhaps the darkest time in Sioux history. The proud warriors and hunters were reduced to standing in line for meager rations. Alcoholism, despair, and violence plagued the communities. Disease, particularly tuberculosis, ravaged people weakened by malnutrition and despair. The population declined precipitously. Children were forcibly removed to distant boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their language, had their hair cut short, and were taught that everything about their culture was inferior and shameful. The school's motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," summed up their philosophy of cultural genocide. Into this despair came a new religious movement in 1890. A Paiute prophet named Wovoka preached that the world would soon be renewed, the buffalo would return, the dead would come back to life, and white people would disappear. To hasten this renewal, people should perform a sacred circle dance, which white observers called the ghost dance. The ghost dance spread rapidly across the demoralized reservations. For the Sioux, It offered hope that their suffering would end and the old life would return. American authorities, particularly the Indian agents on the reservations, viewed the ghost dance with alarm. They saw it as a potential uprising, a rejection of American authority, and a return to savagery. When Sioux on the reservations took up the ghost dance with fervor, the agents panicked and called for military intervention. Sitting Bull, living on Standing Rock Reservation, was suspected of supporting the movement. On December 15, 1890, Indian police went to arrest him. In the confusion, shooting broke out, and Sitting Bull was killed along with his son and several police and ghost dancers. Sitting Bull's death terrified many Sioux, who feared they would be punished for the ghost dance. A group of Miniconjou Lakota under Chief Bigfoot fled their reservation, heading toward Pine Ridge Reservation where they hoped to find safety with Red Cloud. The army intercepted them near Wounded Knee Creek on December 28, 1890. The soldiers, part of the reconstituted 7th Cavalry seeking revenge for Little Bighorn, ordered the Lakota to camp and began disarming them the next morning. The exact sequence of events at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29, 1890, remains disputed, but the outcome is clear. Shooting broke out, possibly when a weapon accidentally discharged during the disarmament, possibly when a medicine man called for resistance, and the soldiers opened fire with rifles and rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns. The Lakota had few weapons and little chance to defend themselves. When the shooting stopped, about 250 to 300 Lakota were dead, many of them women and children. Some had been killed while fleeing, shot down in the ravines where they sought cover. 25 soldiers died, some likely from friendly fire. The dead Lakota were buried in a mass grave after a blizzard left their frozen bodies scattered across the battlefield. Wounded Knee marked the symbolic end of the Indian Wars. The Great Sioux resistance was finished. The survivors were confined to reservations and the old way of life was gone. The buffalo were extinct in the wild. The vast grasslands were being fenced and plowed, and the Sioux were expected to vanish, to be assimilated into the dominant culture until nothing remained of their identity. It seemed that the Sioux story was over, that they would become a tragic footnote in the history of American expansion. But the Sioux did not vanish. Despite everything, they endured. On reservations carved from their once vast territory, they maintained their language, their ceremonies, and their identity, even when those things were illegal. Parents taught children Lakota in secret. The Sundance continued in hidden locations. Stories of Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and the other great leaders were passed down, keeping alive the memory of when the Sioux were free and powerful. The 20th century brought new challenges and new forms of resistance. The government's policy of allotment divided reservation land into individual parcels, with surplus land opened to white settlement. This policy, implemented through the Dawes Act, was designed to break up tribal lands and force assimilation. But it also resulted in Sioux losing millions of acres of their already reduced territory. During World War I and World War II, many Sioux men served in the U.S. military with distinction, a complicated legacy for a people who had been enemies of that same military a generation or two before. The 1960s and 1970s brought a new wave of indigenous activism, and the Sioux were at its forefront. In 1973, members of the American Indian movement, including many Lakota, occupied the site of the Wounded Knee Massacre for 71 days, demanding the government honor its treaties and investigate corruption on reservations. The siege brought national attention to the conditions on reservations and the broken promises that had characterized federal Indian policy. While the occupation ended without achieving all its goals, it marked a turning point in indigenous activism and pride. Legal battles over the Black Hills continued throughout the 20th century. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Sioux Nation that the seizure of the Black Hills had been illegal and awarded the Sioux tribes over $100 million in compensation. The Sioux refused the money. They did not want compensation, they wanted the Black Hills returned. The money has remained unclaimed, growing with interest to over $1 billion, while the Sioux continue to demand the return of their sacred land. The Black Hills are not for sale remains a rallying cry for Sioux sovereignty and identity. Today, the Sioux Nation comprises numerous distinct tribes on reservations in South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana. The largest reservations include Pine Ridge, Standing Rock, Rosebud, and Cheyenne River. Life on many reservations remains challenging. Poverty rates are high, unemployment can exceed 70% on some reservations, and health outcomes lag far behind national averages. Alcoholism, substance abuse, and suicide remain serious problems, legacies of historical trauma and ongoing marginalization. Yet alongside these challenges is resilience and renewal. The Lakota language, which was nearly lost, is being revived through immersion schools and language programs. The Sundance is performed openly, drawing participants from across the Sioux Nation. Traditional arts like beadwork, quillwork, and star quilts thrive. Young people are reclaiming their heritage, learning the stories and traditions that survived the boarding schools and forced assimilation. Sioux political activism continues as well. The Standing Rock Reservation gained international attention in 2016 when the tribe challenged the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was slated to cross the Missouri River near the reservation. Concerns about water contamination and the pipeline's route through sacred sites sparked massive protests. Thousands of indigenous people and allies from around the world came to Standing Rock in solidarity, making it the largest gathering of indigenous peoples in modern times. While the pipeline was ultimately completed, the resistance at Standing Rock energized indigenous activism and brought attention to ongoing violations of treaty rights. The Sioux story is not just one of suffering and loss, though there is plenty of both. It is also a story of extraordinary resilience, of a people who survived genocide, both physical and cultural, and maintained their identity. The names that resonate from Sioux history, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, Bigfoot, are not just names of the past, but symbols of resistance and dignity that continue to inspire. The values that sustained the Sioux through their golden age on the plains, courage, generosity, respect for the sacred, commitment to community, still guide them today. Understanding Sioux history requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about American expansion. The story of the American West is often told as one of pioneers bringing civilization to wilderness, of progress and manifest destiny. But from the Sioux perspective, it is a story of invasion, of broken treaties, of land theft, of cultural genocide, and of survival against overwhelming odds. The treaties that promised Sioux land forever were broken not from misunderstanding, but from deliberate policy choices when that land became valuable. The destruction of the buffalo was not an accident, but a strategy to starve the Sioux into submission. The boarding schools were not misguided charity, but deliberate attempts to destroy Sioux culture. Yet acknowledging this history need not lead to despair, but to understanding. The Sioux survived. They are still here, still fighting for their rights, still practicing their culture, still telling their stories. Every Lakota speaker, every Sundance, every legal battle for treaty rights, every child who learns the stories of their ancestors is a victory against the forces that tried to erase them. The Sioux story is ongoing, not finished, and its next chapters will be written by Sioux people themselves as they navigate the challenges of preserving their culture and sovereignty in the modern world. The land that the Sioux once controlled, the northern Great Plains, still bears the marks of their presence. Place names in Lakota dot the map. The Black Hills rise from the prairie as sacred as they ever were, even as Mount Rushmore carves the faces of presidents into their granite faces. The Missouri River still flows, as the treaties promised it would, forever. The grass still grows, though much of it is now contained in ranches and farms. The treaties that promised this land to the Sioux, as long as the rivers flow and the grass grows, were broken, but the Sioux have not forgotten, and they have not given up their claim. In learning about the Sioux, we learn not just about a particular people, but about fundamental questions that still resonate today. How do peoples maintain their identity and culture in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate? What does sovereignty mean, and who has the right to determine the fate of a land and its people? How do we reckon with historical injustices while moving forward? How do we honor both the suffering of the past and the resilience of the present? The Sioux were never the simple savages of old Western movies, nor are they the romantic, noble savages of sentimental imagination. They were and are real people with a complex history, a sophisticated culture, profound spiritual traditions, and an ongoing struggle to maintain their identity and rights. They were people who adapted brilliantly to the harsh environment of the Great Plains, creating a culture centered on the buffalo and the horse that flourished for over a century. They were warriors who fought fiercely to defend their land and way of life. They were diplomats who negotiated treaties they hoped would secure their future. They were human beings who loved their children, honored their elders, celebrated their victories, and mourned their losses. The golden age of Sioux culture on the plains was brief in historical terms, roughly a century and a half from the acquisition of horses to the confinement to reservations. But it left an indelible mark on American history and imagination. The image of the mounted plains warrior living in tipis and following the buffalo became iconic, influencing everything from Western art to Hollywood films. Unfortunately, this iconography often reduced the Sioux and other plains tribes to stereotypes, freezing them in a romantic past, rather than acknowledging them as dynamic peoples with ongoing histories. As we conclude this journey through Sioux history, from their origins in the Great Lakes woodlands, through their dominance of the northern plains, through the conflicts with the United States and the dark years of the reservation period, to their ongoing struggle for sovereignty and cultural survival, we should recognize that this is not a complete story. No single narrative can capture the full complexity of any people's history, least of all in the scope of one telling. What we have explored tonight is a framework for understanding the environmental changes that shaped Sioux culture, the political structures that governed their society, the spiritual beliefs that gave meaning to their lives, the economic systems based on the buffalo, the conflicts that arose from irreconcilable visions of how the land should be used, and the resilience that has allowed Sioux culture to survive attempts to destroy it. The Sioux elders have a saying, Mitakuye Oyasin, which translates to all my relations, or we are all related. It reflects a worldview in which everything, people, animals, plants, earth, sky, is interconnected in a web of kinship and mutual obligation. This understanding sustained the Sioux through their time of plenty on the plains, giving them a framework for living in harmony with their environment. It guided them through the darkest times on the reservations, maintaining the bonds of community and culture that kept their identity alive. And it continues to guide them today as they work to heal the wounds of history while maintaining their traditions and sovereignty. The story of the Sioux is ultimately a story about what it means to be a people, to have a culture, an identity that persists across generations despite catastrophic disruption. It is about the power of community, the importance of memory, and the possibility of survival even when survival seems impossible. The Sioux did not vanish, as many predicted and some hoped they would. They are still here, still Sioux, still telling their stories and fighting their battles. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you might reflect on this remarkable story of survival and resistance. The Sioux transformed themselves from woodland people to masters of the plains, created a rich culture adapted to one of the harshest environments on the continent, resisted the most powerful nation on earth longer than almost any other indigenous people, and ultimately survived attempts to destroy them physically and culturally. They remain a living people with a living culture, proof that identity and tradition can endure even the most determined efforts at erasure. The Great Plains are quieter now than they were in the days when millions of buffalo darkened the Sioux. Prairie and thousands of Sioux followed them in freedom. But if you visit that land today, the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, and you listen carefully, you can still feel the presence of those who called it home. The wind across the grass carries echoes of the past, of hunts and battles, of ceremonies and celebrations, of suffering and survival. The Sioux are part of that land, and it is part of them, and that connection endures. Tonight, we have journeyed through centuries, from forests to prairies, through times of freedom and times of oppression, through battles won and lost, through cultural death and cultural rebirth. The Sioux story is not a simple one of victims and villains, but a complex narrative of real people navigating impossible choices, fighting to preserve what they valued, and finding ways to survive when survival seemed impossible. As we bring this narrative to a close, remember that every story we have touched upon tonight, from the first acquisition of horses to the ghost dance at Wounded Knee, from the victory at Little Bighorn to the resistance at Standing Rock, is part of a larger story that continues to unfold. The Sioux people are writing new chapters of their history every day, chapters of cultural revival, legal battles, education, art, and activism. They honor their past while building their future, remembering the warriors and chiefs who resisted while creating new forms of resistance appropriate to modern times. The treaties may have been broken, the buffalo may be gone, and the old freedom of the plains may never return, but the Sioux endure. They carry forward the language, the ceremonies, the values, and the memories. They teach their children who they are and where they come from. They fight in courts and legislatures for their rights and their sovereignty. They create art that honors their traditions while speaking to contemporary experience. They are not relics of the past, but living peoples with agency and voice, deserving of respect and understanding. Rest now, and may the story of the Sioux, their strength, their suffering, their survival, stay with you. May it remind you of the complexity of history, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ongoing nature of justice. The Sioux story is American history, and it is human history, and it matters. The grass still grows on the plains, the rivers still flow, and the Sioux people still walk the earth, carrying forward the legacy of their ancestors and shaping their own destiny. Mitakuye Oyasing. We are all related. In understanding the Sioux, we understand something about ourselves, about our shared history, and about the ongoing work of creating a more just world. Sleep well and carry this knowledge with you. The story continues.